what? A talk about documentation? This way, or a similar way, the Clojure account introduced this talk on their Twitter stream. And in a way, 1.5 years ago, I would never have thought that I would be in India giving a talk about documentation. Like, who wants to talk about documentation anyways? But so now I'm here. My name is Martin, as was already mentioned. You can usually find me on the internet as Martin Klepsch, and if you have any questions or want to discuss some stuff, feel free to reach me on Twitter or Slack or email or whatever. You'll find me. Just to give you some context about myself, in the past I have contributed to some other open source projects. Two of you might know cljdoc and Boot. I co-created cljdoc with Juho Tepuri like 4 years ago or something, and it's really amazing how far the Clojure script ecosystem has come since then. I also wrote a bunch of Clojure libraries, none of which you probably heard of, and that's entirely fine. But I had a lot of fun writing it, so that's okay. But today I don't want to talk about cljdoc or Boot or my boring libraries. Today I want to talk about cljdoc. And so before we get into what cljdoc is and that kind of stuff, I think it's a good opportunity to recap some fundamental ideas and thoughts about documentation. So documentation is this guiding star you see in the sky. Often it's barely visible because there's so little of it. It's the readmes and it's the doc strings that are provided by library authors and by language authors, guiding you on your way to achieve whatever you're trying to achieve. Similar to open source code, documentation, the value of documentation increases every time it's used. So every time someone uses an open source library of you, the value that library created is essentially doubling. And so you could say the same is true for documentation. Every time someone reads that documentation, your knowledge and your understanding is being replicated in that other person. And I think that's an interesting contrast compared to physical goods, where you usually have this effect where the resource that you're sharing degrades over time or degrades with usage. This is also often called an anti-rival good, which I find an interesting concept to think about. So in short, the better we get at sharing and creating documentation, the more utility and value it creates for the people using it. And ultimately also for us, because we also use our own documentation. With code, we share the implementation of something specific. We share the implementation of how to generate a PDF, or we share the implementation of how to manage a system. With documentation, we share our understanding of doing so and using these tools. And that allows others not to fiddle and fumble for hours before they get something to work. In the Clojure community, we have this very interesting distinction between simple and easy. For, I think, many people outside this community, simple and easy are kind of the same thing. And who can blame them? I mean, they're pretty close. But sometimes you could get the impression that it's a pick one type of situation. You want simple, but you also want easy, but often, like, if you really make it simple, it requires so much understanding and so much learning before it actually becomes simple. But of course, it's not a pick one type of situation. And I believe documentation is an essential factor when you try to make simple things easy. Easy things are familiar. And so also in this talk that Rachiki gave, I think he made this interesting explanation of easy things, and I think the origin of the world also came from familiarity. And documentation can really help build up that familiarity that you have by knowing some concepts or something, you know, and relating something new to those things. So essentially you integrate something new that you didn't know before into your sphere of knowledge, making more sense of it and understanding it better. So now that we have established how useful and important and awesome documentation is, let's talk about documentation in the Clojure community. First of all, let's make a distinction. There always is going to be documentation for the language and the ecosystem. So for the language, we have documentation for SOH and conj and hash maps and stuff like that. And in the ecosystem, we have more specific stuff that is sort of outside of the regular language. In this talk, I want to focus on the ecosystem part of documenting the Clojure ecosystem well. And I think that's also something that has been overlooked in the past a little bit. There's many sites where you can read documentation on Clojure, the language, but there has not been so much effort towards improving the documentation for the ecosystem. And I believe that often the magic happens in the ecosystem, right? Like Clojure has a very small, very focused standard library. And a lot of useful, very nice things are happening in this ecosystem, in the libraries people make, that we all know and love and use every day. So to give you an idea of how it is, if you publish a library and you want to publish documentation for that library, I'm just going to review how the process is of publishing the documentation for that library. First, you publish your library. That's a precondition, I guess. And then maybe, not everyone does this, you make an active decision to publish documentation for this library. So we already lose a few people there. Actually, not a few, actually a lot. Then we lose another few people when they try to set up the tool to generate this documentation. This could be Codocs or it could be any other tool. There's plenty of out there. Marginalia is another one that has an interesting approach too. And we lose some people there. Then we lose some more people when they try to put the resulting HTML files on some website or GitHub pages or S3 or whatever. And then ultimately, when this person who just went through all these steps and made all this effort cuts a new release of their library, they will likely forget to update their documentation. And I wasn't aware of all that friction until December 2017 in Berlin, when my friend Arne, who I'm also organizing this conference with, gave a small talk about a script he made that helped you publish documentation and that kind of thing. And the discussion after the talk and the discussion in the Berlin community was very interesting, and it stimulated some thoughts and made me aware of some things that exist in other languages. So in other languages, there are these websites where you can view documentation for libraries. In the REST community, there's docs.rs. Docs.rs allows you to view the API documentation and articles and documents for specific libraries. In the Elixir community, you have HexDocs. In the Dart community, Dart of all, you have something else. You have a similar thing for Go, and so on. So in many communities, these tools exist. Why is there none in Clojure? And would it even be possible to have one in Clojure? Clojure is a very dynamic language, and if you noticed all the languages I just mentioned, they provide some facilities to do some sort of static analysis. You can get information about the API in some module without running the code. And in Clojure, you can't. In Clojure, if you want to know how many arguments or what the argument names are or what the doc string of a namespace is, you essentially have to run that namespace. And could we even do that? Like, this is a problem, right? We cannot just run arbitrary code that might just delete our disk or leak environment variables somewhere or something like that. So could we do this? Is this even possible? Or is the Clojure community forever doomed to not have nice websites like the ones I just showed you? I looked into a lot of approaches to do this. So at first, I thought it was Docker. Then I looked into AWS Lambda. Then it was Kubernetes, and so on. It almost got very buzzword compliant. But in the end, I came up with something very stupid, I guess, but it works great. So it's not stupid. If it works, it's not stupid. Somewhere at that time, I also was very excited about this whole idea and like really energetic, and gave a small talk at the Berlin Clojure meetup, like the one after the one I showed you this picture of. And I had a small example, a small demo. Yeah, so I just like to show this picture because it's like how it started, and it just looks very bad. But you'll see how it looks later. So let me tell you how I solved this isolation and this security problem that arises from Clojure being a dynamic language and not exposing many facilities for static analysis. When you come to cljdoc and you want to view documentation for a library, either that documentation is already there, it has already been built, or you can request it to be built. Nowadays, when a new release is published to Clojures, the documentation on cljdoc is automatically built, but that has not been the case for more than 6 months or something like that. So there are still many libraries for which documentation has not been built yet. So when you come to cljdoc to request some documentation, you can request the build, as I mentioned. And the moment you do this, cljdoc will start a circle CI job. So that's the grand hack I mentioned. And in this circle CI job, we're going to run the code. And we're going to extract all this information about the code, like all the namespaces and all the functions in those namespaces, and the argument lists of those functions and the doc strings, and so on and so on. And we'll extract all of that. And if things don't blow up, we will store that information in a build artifact of that circle CI build. This allows us to then send back that information to our cljdoc service, where it's integrated into the database and then later on shown to the user. Somewhere at that point, cljdoc will also clone the GitHub repository linked to that library and integrate the README and the changelog and that kind of stuff. But this has never been like a problematic issue, so it's not too interesting to talk about. The user is able to follow that entire process through a page like this. And so in this case, everything went well. I'm not going to show you the page with errors on it, right? But yeah, if something fails, they will see it there, and they can open an issue or jump into Slack or something like that. So other languages have these kind of websites or had these kind of websites for a while. And while this is a fine motivation on its own, I think, I also want to talk a bit more about like why I think a website for library documentation is particularly useful. So if you remember this, right, I think we can all agree that like really we want this. We don't want to have 15 steps where we have to do things because actually nobody's gonna do them. And I also believe that by taking away all these steps, we free up people's time, right? Maybe if you think about this, like how long does it take you to do all these steps? Like maybe it takes you an hour, maybe it takes you 2 hours, depending on how often you did it before. And by freeing up this time, we allow people to focus on actual documentation and to write better documentation instead of fumbling like with some tool that is very secondary to their original goal of providing documentation to their users. Another part of the documentation, another part of the motivation, I say documentation so often, it's horrible, is easily explained by this small example. And so what you can see here, it's not important, the text is not important, so if you can't read it, don't worry. Is like a small quick switching tool. So similar to when you change channels in Slack or something, you can hit Command K and you can switch between recently viewed projects. And this is only possible because all the documentation for all the libraries is in one place. If every library author puts their documentation in a separate, disparate place, you cannot do this kind of thing. It's just impossible. And so the second part of the motivation is to provide a consistent and ever-improving user experience for people to access this documentation in a, as I already said, consistent manner. Now, by improving documentation, I think the Clojure ecosystem will ultimately become more approachable to beginners, or at least that's my hope. And even experienced Clojure programmers will be able to get their job done faster because they have better access to the tools they need, and documentation being one of these tools. So this has all been fairly abstract, right? Like except for like 2 screenshots, you basically haven't seen any of it. So let's get to demo time. In the next couple of slides, I'll walk you through a couple of features that cljdoc provides for using documentation, and explain why I think they're awesome, basically. First of all, everything is versioned. So you remember this thing where I said the library author would forget to update. Usually when the library authors update documentation, they delete the old documentation, right? So when you're on the old version, your documentation is gone. And you can find it in your Google cache or something. Obviously, this is not nice. And so on cljdoc, everything is versioned, and old versions are kept around for everyone to use forever. Then cljdoc also provides, beyond API documentation, articles. Now something here is weird. But anyways, articles. And so you can use articles to provide additional information. So in this case, a library author provided information about the performance of his library, integrated some charts with a markdown file, and you can integrate all that into your documentation so people can readily access it from one unified interface. The README and changelog are always incorporated automatically, and if you want to incorporate any more documentation files, you can provide a little Eden file in your GitHub repository, or in your Git repository, I should say, that describes the structure of this document tree. So you can have as many documentation files as you want, basically. Now, I already touched on this. Of course, there's also API documentation, and you can view namespaces. You can see methods of protocols that are defined in this namespace, all that kind of stuff that you probably already know from Clojure API documentation. What you don't know from Clojure API documentation is that it is platform aware. So all the documentation on cljdoc is for Clojure and Clojure script. So usually when people write cross-platform code with Clojure and Clojure script, everything's the same, right? But sometimes a function will have a different doc string or a different number of arguments because they're platform specific. And so in cljdoc, you can see that, and the doc strings and argument list and all that is properly indicated if it varies between these 2 platforms. You can also see the different source links. So in the video you just saw, there are 2 links for the source for Clojure and Clojure script. And so you can jump to these locations independently and see the source for your respective platform. Another small thing, interestingly, this is a snippet from a library Kumar Shantu. I think, I hopefully I got the name right, wrote, who's also here today. I haven't met him yet, but I hopefully will. And it has this like a very complex argument, right, or a very complex default. And cljdoc uses zprint, a formatting tool, to format this to be very readable and nice on the eye. You can also download documentation for offline use. So I'm a huge fan of, I don't know, sitting on a train or a plane or in my hammock and doing some hacking, and sometimes you don't have internet. And I think downloading documentation is a really nice facility. And so here you can download like a more minimal UI or a more minimal view on the documentation. But it's all there, and it's all available for you offline. This is also the foundation for something I'll show you later, which I'm very excited about. Now, I mentioned that the data that we get from this build from CircleCI goes into a database, right? And so that also opens up a lot of possibilities. Just one very important discovery I made is who wrote the longest doc string ever. And so the winner is Miha from Keychma Toolbox, or who wrote Keychma Toolbox. He wrote this doc string. it's longer than many READMEs we've seen, I think. And yeah, I just think it's really also really nicely formatted. Like it has code snippets, it has lists. You know, it's just like, if I would use this library, I would be like, yes. Since recently, you can now also use cljdoc on your mobile device, whoever might want to do that, and that just works fine too. And now, I mentioned earlier, the offline bundles are the foundation for something else. And they're the foundation for the Dash integration of cljdoc. So I don't know who here is familiar with Dash? Oh wow, that's quite a few people. You're gonna love this. So Dash is this documentation browsing tool, and you just bind it to a global hotkey, and you can search documentation through Java, JavaScript, HTML, Clojure, and whatnot. And now you can download library documentation, Clojure library documentation into this app as well. So here we just downloaded the documentation for DataScript and Ring. And now we can search for stuff in DataScript or stuff in Ring. We can navigate the namespace through this list that you see in the bottom left. If you can't read the text, it's not important. Like, as long as you get the idea of the thing, that's totally fine. The cool thing there is also you can bind specific doc sets. That's what they're called, like the units. One DataScript would be one doc set. You can bind it to a prefix. So for instance here, I bound ring core to ring. And so whenever I want to search something in ring, I just type ring : and then I type something else, like wrap params or something. And if you're using a library a lot, this can be really helpful to like just look up stuff quickly and this kind of thing. All right, so that was the tour. Just to give you an idea of how this thing came to be and how it's working, we already talked a bit about components, so I'm happy to also say something about that. cljdoc is built on Pedestal. It's using Integrand, which is like a different variant of component in a way. It's using Hiccup for generating HTML, which is very convenient. If you haven't used that, it's like the best thing ever. It's using Nippy to serialize data, so a lot of the data stored for cljdoc is actually like stored in blobs, like binary encoded blobs, and that works perfectly fine. It's probably not what anyone ever tells you to do, but like it works great. We're using juxt.io for configuration loading stuff. JGit to access Git repositories, that's also really nice. SQLite for storage. SQLite is awesome. If you, I don't know, like for so many things, SQLite is like perfect. And finally, using Terraform and Nomad to provision infrastructure and deploy the application and do that kind of stuff. Overall, it's about like 3,700, 500, whatever, something between 3,500 and 4,000 lines of code, depending on how you count. And I think for, like, it still feels fairly small. So the majority of that code is the code just rendering HTML, right? And that's really not very complicated. Like most of the code is very dull and very easy to understand, is what I'm trying to say. So let's recap. cljdoc today, what does it provide you? It provides you with platform-aware documentation for Clojure and ClojureScript, highlighting differences when there are some. It provides you articles, so you can understand concepts behind the library or just read more about what the authors thought. Offline bundles, so you can view documentation offline. Everything's permanent and versioned, so you never lose your documentation or links break or stuff like that. Everything's backed by a database, allowing for a lot of interesting use cases, like figuring out what the longest doc string is. And it's ready on your mobile device. But so this all works today, right? And I worked on this for like the last 6 months or so. And I think I'm very proud of this, but there's still so much more that could be done. And so last time I had this slide was a while ago, and so I'm very happy to now have this transition where like I already did this. But let's talk a bit about the other things that could be added to cljdoc or that would make useful additions to the tool. One thing I find particularly interesting, which isn't even a big thing really, is change detection. So because we have the entire API of a library as data, we can just diff it. And by diffing it, we can figure out, oh, this function had three arguments in version 1, and it only has 2 arguments in version 2. And that's a breaking change. And we can generate like a code-aware changelog based on Clojure semantics. And I think I've never seen something like that, and I would be very excited to see it. And it's actually, someone should just do it, but I'm a procrastinator, so I didn't yet. Another thing I've also been working on for a while is examples. And a lot of people have suggested this, and examples is something that people often use to learn and understand the library and to understand how like a function works and that kind of thing. And I really, really would like to integrate examples, and I worked on this for a month or so, but eventually decided to put that work aside. And that is because I believe if you really want to make examples work, and if you really want that to be useful to not just library users, but also library authors, they have to be runnable and they have to be testable. So the moment you write an example that is not tested, it will just bit rot and eventually not work anymore, causing frustration for library authors and users alike. So I think to really succeed with examples, it's very important that they're runnable and are part of sort of your testing practice. And this is a much bigger project than what I was willing to sort of take on for this initial work on it. Clojure spec has already been talked about today, and of course is also something people came at the very first version of cljdoc, they were like, oh, we need Clojure spec, and it's a good idea, and I would really like to integrate Clojure spec, especially integrating Clojure spec into a database could be interesting, because potentially it allows you to provide workflows that were previously exclusive to people working with type systems. So you could imagine that you have 2 specs and you want to figure out what function goes from one spec to the other, right? And there's search engines for Haskell that allow you to do this. And how awesome would it be if a similar search engine existed for Clojure? But unfortunately, there's still some issues with the implementation of spec that sort of make this a little bit problematic at this point. Specifically, it's important to be able to infer what file a spec is originating from. Specs currently don't have metadata, and so this information is not available to me or the code running or analyzing those specs. There's a ticket on Jira about adding metadata support to spec, so if you're all gonna upload that, that's gonna be good. All right, cljdoc Enterprise, I put that in quotes because Enterprise always sounds weird, but is an on-premise version of cljdoc. So a lot of people or a lot of companies that use Clojure have internal libraries, and they also need documentation for those libraries. And so the idea is kind of that they could just sort of throw up a Docker container with cljdoc and build documentation and stuff like that. And so I've been doing some work on that for a company that is interested in doing that. Yeah, we're gonna skip the rest. I think APIs are interesting. Like there's so much stuff we could do, but we don't have to talk about all of that. Let's instead talk a bit about how you can use cljdoc and how you can get the most of it. So first of all, using cljdoc as a library user is pretty straightforward, right? I think you just go to cljdoc.org, there's a search bar, you put in the library you want to use, you hit enter, and you're kind of done. That's like the workflow. But if you're a library author, there's some more things you could be doing and you should be doing perhaps. First of all, you should check that the documentation for your project can be built. So as I mentioned, there's some code running on Circle CI, And there's all sorts of reasons why that code fails. I think at this point, maybe 25% of builds fail. Excuse me. This is for all sorts of reasons. Like, for instance, there's one library that does GPU accelerated programming with Clojure, and it requires CUDA graphic card drivers to be installed. And that we don't have that on CircleCI. It's never going to work. That's just how it is. But so if you have a library, and if you want it to be available in cljdoc, you can go to cljdoc, search for your library, check that it can be built. And if it can't be built, then jump into Slack or send me a message on Twitter or something, and we'll see what we can do. After you've done that, you can add a small batch to GitHub README so people can find the documentation, and so you don't have to worry about publishing documentation anymore. The batch will always also show the version your library is currently at. And now with that, all that newly found time that you have, because you're no longer spending time worrying about your documentation, you can actually write it. So a good third step is going into your code base, improving your doc strings, adding some markdown, adding some code snippets, maybe an example into the doc string, that kind of stuff. And then you can cut a new release and you'll see the fruits of your work on cljdoc. And if you have anything beyond a README and a changelog, which are incorporated automatically, you can also add those by providing an Eden file. The details on how to do all that are in the link that's at the bottom of the slide. It's all fairly straightforward, I would say, but maybe I'm biased, maybe. All right. So I've been working on this for like 6 months. I started like early last year, about this time actually of the year. And I'm having like a tremendous amount of fun doing it. But I also know that like this is open source work and I cannot do this in this intensity forever. And so I believe it's very important that this project, if it is useful to the community, is also owned by the community. And so I've always tried to make an extra effort to invite people to contribute and also help them contribute and provide guidance around contributing. So specifically, why should you be contributing? Why should you help maintain this project, or why should you help improve it? First of all, can you read this? Yeah, okay, cool. It's a useful project, and there's a friendly community around it. There's maybe some up to 10 people that are like regularly active. There's help and guidance when you get started. There's plenty of issues that are tagged with good first issue that are small and like attainable for a newcomer to the project. It's a 3,700 lines of code, real world application. I think that's also something you don't always get the opportunity to work on. If you work in a company, you work on real world applications, but maybe if you've only done like Clojure open source libraries. And working on a library is a very different thing than working on an application. And I think that's a useful experience to gain if you haven't done it. Many important decisions of the project have been documented in ADR's architecture decision records. So an architecture decision record is a neat little tool for you to document when you make an important decision. And it's basically just like 3 sections. It says context, decision, consequences. And I find this to be a very useful tool to think about, like, oh, am I going to use this database? Am I going to use this tool? Am I going to do that? To think about that and to write it up and to maybe also get feedback from other people, like critiquing my thinking. So if you ever think I made some wrong decisions, you can read up why I made them and why I felt that way. Last but certainly not least, you'll get some stickers. I've never sent mail in my life much, but since starting this project, I invited people to send me their address once they contributed, and now I'm like sending mail all the time, and it's horrible. Sending mail is not fun. All right, time to thank some people. First of all, Clojure is Together. Who of you is familiar with Clojure is Together? Okay, okay, so it's good that I'm saying. Clojure Together is a community-funded institution sort of that funds Clojure open source stuff. And so for 3 months, they've also funded my work on cljdoc, which was nice. And now they're funding other projects, and I think it's a very useful initiative if we want to ensure that many libraries that are important to the Clojure community receive the time and support they need. So if you're not a member, or if that's interesting to you, just check it out. And then I would also, of course, like to thank all the contributors to cljdoc. I think it's 34 by now. And it's been really nice to like meet so many people on this journey and get so much nice feedback and stuff like that. And people really have a lot of ideas, and I think it's nice when people come together and like sort of create something together. Okay, that's all. If you have any questions at all, you can ask me later here. You can ping me on Slack, Twitter, wherever. All right, thanks.
We have time for some questions, if people have any. Aditya has one, Vedang has one.
So this may be stupid because I'm not aware of it, but wasn't there a different project called Grimoire or something like that which was similar? And how does, like, is there any history there?
So Grimoire, right? That's what you said, yeah. So it's a very good question. So Grimoire, I think was mostly focused on Clojure core, like the standard library, you could say. But interestingly, when I started cljdoc, Grimoire had a storage layer that was very well suited to this structure of Clojure, right? Like it had an understanding of namespaces and functions. So early versions of cljdoc actually used the same persistence layer as Grimoire. But I think Grimoire, since then, isn't being actively developed. And also, as I said, like it's always been focused on the standard library. So this is the distinction I would draw, I think, about these two tools. Any more questions?
Yeah. I'm actually curious if...
yeah, okay.
I'm curious if you actually have managed to get like editor integration with cljdoc, so you're actually...
what integration?
Editor integration, like your text editor, like you can actually pull up docs.
Yeah.
cljdocs, like
yeah.
in your editor. Is like, do you think that's easy or possible? Or?
Certainly possible. So I was thinking about this in the beginning a lot more than I'm thinking about it now. So if you're using Emacs or Cursive or something, there's little value to using cljdoc because these tools understand the Clojure runtime, right? They look up the doc string when you are on this thing, right? But there's other editors like Visual Studio Code and Atom and stuff, and many newcomers to Clojure prefer to use a tool like this and don't have access to this actually like fairly nice features that are provided by Emacs and Cursive. And so I had this idea of an API where like the editor could sort of query doc strings and sort of documentation on a thing, but it didn't go anywhere yet. So, but it's possible, and like providing an API for this kind of thing is like, yeah, it's not a lot of work.
Cool, thank you.
You're welcome.
No, go ahead.
So again, perhaps a very noob question, but I don't understand why it's important to run the project. Like, what information is available in the runtime that's not available from static files, you know?
From what?
From static files, just like non-running files. Because one other way, if all the information is available in files, then perhaps, you know, we have rewrite CLJ, or like it's essentially an EDN document on disk, and we could like pick up top level forms and knowing the you know, all the various ways in which someone could write a defn or a def. We could possibly do something.
Yeah, the problem is there is an infinite amount of ways to write a defn or a def. So that's if you if you're okay with just supporting def and defn and that kind of thing, you might be able to get something to work. Like that could work. You could write some static analysis. And as far as I know, Cursive, this editor based on IntelliJ, Colin, the author, he wrote some static analysis tooling that does something like that. But it's always going to be inferior to actually looking at the runtime and inspecting, like calling NS publics on the namespace and stuff like that.
Right.
And so one good example of this, just to drive this home, there is this library called Amazonica, and it's a library to access Amazon services with Clojure. And if you look at the source for this library, there's not a single function that is, or well, there are functions, but like none of the API defined by those Amazon libraries is defined in the source code. So there is just like one macro that sort of defines them all. And if you just look at these files, you will never be able to tell what functions are in there. So that's...
So I assume that macros and macro expansion, that might mess up with the runtime versus, static file thing. So
yeah, exactly. That I think macros is kind of like they're at fault. Let's remove them. No, I don't think that's going to work. Okay, one more question or no?
We can take more questions offline.
Okay,
Maybe.
yeah, cool. I'm fine. Right, cool.
Thanks,
Thank you very
Martin.
much.